So let's examine our human soul, the soul itself. I've drawn these things before. So here we are, we've got our soul, and perhaps the way I could draw it is like this in the beginning, but the trouble is you can't see that, so I'll have to just expand that up to this. So remembering that when it's first created, it's at its most tiniest of states. And its growth is dependent upon a number of things. So just like a baby, when it's first created, it begins in the cell. As soon as the two cells merge, in that split cell state, that's its smallest time, right? But it still exists. And it's a similar thing with the human soul, that the human soul is created in a similar way, and then expansion can occur. But let's say it's this large, right? And it has characteristics and qualities, but basically it has two halves. We've talked about the split of the two halves in a sense, but the reality is the two halves actually don't split. Now, I've talked about it with you as splitting because you need to grasp it in terms of what's happening in the incarnation process. But the reality is, from God's perspective, the two halves are still together. They're not in a unified state yet, but they are together. They are joined together energetically. So you can think of it as joined together as an energy joining them together. Now remember, this soul also, we draw it like this, only because for many of you came from a background of New Age philosophy and so forth, and you recognise that symbol as sort of like a yin-yang, sort of something related to the soul. But the reality is, of course, it doesn't look like that. You know? And I think most of you are probably aware that it doesn't. And in fact, it's not even a three-dimensional form. Its dimensional states change into different dimensional states. And so as it grows, its complexity also grows, and what it looks like grows. And the reality is you won't see these souls until you are in the soul union state yourself. Now, the soul union state is defined as this state where both halves are in a completely aware state with each other and an aware state in their relationship with God, and they've gone through a whole series of processes, received God's love in order to become unified. And in fact, it's impossible for the soul union state to occur without receiving God's love. But the soul energetically is still joined together. So here we are in this state, we're joined with the other half. And then we have to become somehow, and in this state, of course, we're unaware, we don't know who we are yet or any of those things. And a process has to be engaged in order for us to become aware. When we become to the process that God designed to become aware is the process called incarnation. And basically the process of incarnation is that two bodies are created by the commingling of the parental cells through the sexual act. The two bodies are created at that point in time. Both bodies also in a undeveloped state. Just a double cell initially, and then they replicate. There's a genetic structure in those cells that determine how everything replicates and how everything grows. And you can imagine then, can't you, that the soul itself must have some kind of similar thing where it has a genetic structure that means that as it grows it can replicate and change, but the structure is built inside of the soul itself. So the laws, this is the incredible thing about what God's created, is the laws themselves. There's external laws, and then there's laws that are written in the actual genetic structure. So in the genetic structure of the body, the cell structure contains the DNA, which basically are the laws that govern its replication. Right? The same applies to the spirit body, and you would have to assume then, wouldn't you not, that it's probably very similar for the soul. that as it grows and changes, and as it receives divine love, how it changes depends upon some laws that are built inside of the soul itself as a part of its structure, but also that are affected by outside events and circumstances, outside laws. Right? So here we have our soul, most complicated creation, and of course, then once it incarnates, it needs these two bodies, and I'll draw it as a male-female split in this case, just like so. So it needs these two bodies in order for the half of the soul that's unaware of the other half to learn. So spirit body is required, physical body is required. These bodies are both created at the time of conception. And from the moment of conception, the soul can be said to have incarnated and individualized. From that moment on, even though it's still in a state where its awareness is right, the moment before that state, it had no awareness at all of itself. It had instinctual things that are built into the soul itself that requires certain things to activate. And once those particular things occur, those events activate the soul and also its ability to connect to the bodies and so forth, and away that process goes. So the incarnation process requires this process to occur before individualization is complete. So you could say that the individualization process begins at the time of the first half of the soul being conceived, and the individualization process ends at the time the second half of the soul is conceived. Right? Now it's individualized. The job of individualization is complete. The soul, of course, in that state is still very, very undeveloped. So it's like I said, a little tiny cell. It's just in the process of starting its own development. Right? But connected to these bodies, which are also in the conception phase, just a little tiny cell. And then slowly awareness begins, develops. Yeah? Okay.